The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke still rose from the ruined structures, and the ground was scarred with deep craters. The war between the Galactic Dominion and the United Earth Forces had lasted for months. The Zorthar, a warrior race known for their strength and battle experience, believed victory was inevitable. But something was wrong. They were not winning. Viraka, the proud commander of the Zorthar forces, stood tall in the center of the war camp. She was over 8 feet in height, her body covered in thick armor-like scales. Her sharp yellow eyes scanned the horizon. The humans had fought longer and harder than expected. They were supposed to be weak, just another species trying to survive in the galaxy. Yet, they refused to break. The Zorthar prided themselves on strength. In their culture, wars were often settled with duels. The strongest warrior from each side would fight, and the winner's side would claim victory. It was an ancient tradition, one that Viraka had never lost. She turned to her warriors, her voice loud and commanding. Enough of this endless battle. We will settle this as true warriors do. Bring me their best fighter. I will face them in single combat. Her words echoed through the battlefield. A message was sent to the human forces. The challenge was clear. One duel, one champion, and the outcome would decide the fate of this war. The human response. On the other side of the ruined city, the human soldiers gathered. They had received the challenge. Some were nervous, others excited. The Zorthar were terrifying in combat, larger, stronger, and more experienced in war. No human had ever dueled one before. General Carter, the leader of the human forces, read the message again. "They want our best warrior," he said, looking around. "Who will step forward?" There was silence. Then a man stepped out of the crowd. "I'll do it," said Sergeant David Cole. The soldiers turned to look at him. David wasn't the biggest among them. He was tall but lean, his face calm and serious. He had short brown hair, sharp blue eyes, and the quiet confidence of a man who had seen many battles. He had served in special forces back on Earth and had fought in countless wars. Carter frowned. "Are you sure, Sergeant? This is different from any fight you've had before." David nodded. "I've fought enemies bigger than me before, sir. Strength isn't everything." The general studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Then may luck be on your side." David didn't believe in luck. He believed in skill. The arena is set. By noon, the battlefield had been cleared. Soldiers from both sides gathered around a wide open space. It would be their arena. The sky above was gray, the air filled with the scent of smoke and metal. Viraka stepped forward, her massive war axe resting on her shoulder. Her golden armor gleamed under the dull sunlight. She looked at David and narrowed her eyes. "This is their champion?" she asked, her deep voice filled with disbelief. David stood in front of her, holding a simple combat knife. Compared to her, he looked almost small, almost fragile, but his eyes remained steady. "I am," he replied simply. Viraka let out a deep chuckle. "You are either very brave or very foolish." David shrugged. "Maybe a little of both." The audience murmured among themselves. The Zorthar warriors sneered, already imagining their commander's easy victory. The human soldiers were silent, some worried, some curious. A Zorthar elder raised his hand. "The duel begins now." Viraka gripped her war axe tightly. David adjusted his stance. The fight was about to begin. A deep silence fell over the battlefield. Soldiers from both sides stood in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the two warriors in the center. The duel was about to begin. Viraka tightened her grip on her massive war axe, its sharp edges glowing faintly under the gray sky. She was taller, stronger, and heavily armored. Her muscles tensed with anticipation. She had fought countless duels before. This one would be no different. Across from her stood Sergeant David Cole, holding only a combat knife. Compared to Viraka's powerful frame, he looked small, almost fragile. His knife was nothing against the deadly reach of her war axe. Yet he stood calmly, his expression unreadable. His blue eyes studied her every move. The Zorthar warriors chuckled among themselves. To them, this was no contest. It was an execution. The humans, however, remained silent, some clenching their fists in tension. The Zorthar elder raised his clawed hand. The duel begins now. The first strike. Vireka did not hesitate. She lunged forward, swinging her war axe in a powerful arc. The force of her attack could have crushed a boulder. But David was no longer there. He moved just in time, ducking low and rolling to the side. The war axe slammed into the ground, sending dust and debris flying. Vireka's eyes widened slightly. The human had dodged her attack with ease. David didn't waste time. He dashed forward, his knife flashing. He aimed for her side, one of the few weak points in her armor. But Vireka was fast too. She twisted her body and swung the back of her arm at him. David barely managed to jump back, avoiding the strike by inches. The crowd gasped. Vireka frowned. Most enemies she faced fell within seconds. But this human, he was different. He wasn't just fast, he was precise. Every move he made had a purpose. He was studying her, analyzing her, waiting for an opportunity. The warrior's frustration. Vireka charged again, swinging her axe in a deadly arc. She aimed lower this time, trying to catch David off guard. But he was already moving, twisting his body to avoid the attack. She swung again, and again. Each strike was powerful enough to break bones, but none of them landed. David wasn't fighting like a Zorthar. He wasn't trying to block or overpower her. He was using speed, patience, and strategy. Vireka growled in frustration. "Fight me properly, human." David gave a small smile. "I am." He suddenly dashed forward, getting inside her guard. His knife flickered, aiming for a weak spot near her shoulder. Vireka barely managed to raise her arm in time, deflecting the strike. David jumped back before she could counterattack. His blade had not cut deep, but it had left a mark, a tiny crack in her armor. The crowd fell silent. Vireka looked down at the small wound. It was barely a scratch, but that wasn't what bothered her. No one had ever touched her in a duel before. Not once. This human had a different kind of strength. Vireka took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could not let frustration cloud her mind. She was a warrior of the Zorthar. She would not be humiliated. She changed her stance. No more wild swings. No more relying only on strength. She would match him with skill. David noticed the change immediately. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her decision. Vireka attacked again, but this time, her movements were more controlled. She aimed not for raw power, but for precision. David met her strike, sidestepping just in time, his knife flickering in response. Their battle became faster, sharper. Each time Vireka adjusted, David adapted. Each time David moved, Vireka learned. The duel was no longer just about winning. It was a test of skill, patience, and respect. The watching eyes. The soldiers watching were no longer cheering or whispering. They stood frozen, eyes locked on the duel. The Zorthar warriors who had laughed at the beginning were now silent. Their strongest warrior, their undefeated champion, was struggling against a human. The human soldiers who had been nervous now watched with wide eyes. Their champion, the man with only a knife, was holding his own against a giant. The fight was not over yet, but one thing was clear. This was no longer a one-sided match, and Vireka was no longer certain of victory. The battlefield was silent. Thousands of eyes watched the duel, but no one spoke. The laughter from the Zorthar warriors had faded. The nervous whispers of the human soldiers had disappeared. Now there was only the sound of breathing, the shifting of feet, and the occasional clash of weapons. Vireka stood tall, her war axe held firmly in her grip. Her golden armor gleamed under the dull light, and her sharp yellow eyes remained locked on her opponent. She had never faced a warrior like this before. David Cole, the human soldier, stood across from her, holding only a combat knife. His breathing was steady, his stance calm. He was studying her, watching her every move. This duel was supposed to be simple. The strongest Zorthar warrior against the strongest human. Viraka had expected an easy victory, but this was not an easy fight. Testing each other. Viraka exhaled slowly and took a careful step forward. She had learned something important. David was not fighting like a brute. He was fast, precise, and patient. If she wanted to win, she had to match him. She swung her war axe, not with full power, but with control. It was a quick, testing strike, meant to see how David would react. David moved smoothly, stepping just out of reach. He did not waste energy dodging too far, nor did he flinch. Instead, his eyes locked onto her arm, watching the way she moved. Viraka struck again, a sharp diagonal slash. David ducked and sidestepped in one motion. His knife flickered as he moved, and for a brief second, Viraka felt a small pressure against her arm. Then David was gone, slipping away before she could counter. Viraka frowned and looked at her arm. A thin scratch, barely a wound, but it was there. She looked back at David. He was standing exactly where he had started, watching her. His face remained calm, but Viraka could see it now. He was testing her, just as she was testing him. This was not just a fight. This was a game of skill, of reading each other's movements, of learning each other's style. And for the first time in a long, long time, Viraka felt something strange. Excitement. The duel intensifies. Viraka shifted her stance. If this human wanted a fight of skill, then she would give him one. She moved faster now, striking in a series of sharp, controlled attacks. David dodged, blocking when necessary, always staying just outside of danger. But he was not just defending. He was watching, waiting. Then he saw it. A pattern. Viraka's attacks, though fast and strong, followed a rhythm. She always aimed slightly to the left before switching to a stronger right-hand swing. She always adjusted her footwork before a heavy strike. David's eyes narrowed. He had what he needed. The next time Viraka attacked, David acted. Instead of dodging, he stepped forward. The sudden move caught Viraka off guard. She swung, but David was already inside her guard. His knife flashed. A sharp pressure against her side. A controlled, precise strike. Then he was gone again. Viraka froze. She looked down. Another scratch. She touched the spot lightly. If David had wanted to, he could have driven his knife deep into her side. He could have ended the fight. But he hadn't. He had held back. The realization. Viraka looked up at David. Her yellow eyes studied him carefully. "You could have finished me just now," she said. David gave a small shrug. "Maybe." Viraka tightened her grip on her axe. "Why didn't you?" David tilted his head slightly. "The fight's not over yet." For a long moment, Viraka was silent. Then, slowly, a grin spread across her face. She had never fought a warrior like this before. She had fought brute strength. She had fought speed. She had fought endurance. But she had never fought someone who fought with patience. David was not trying to win with force. He was trying to learn. And that was far more dangerous. The battle continues. Viraka raised her axe again, but this time, her stance was different. She no longer saw David as just another opponent. She saw him as an equal. The Zorthar warriors watching were stunned. They had never seen their commander look at an enemy with such respect. The human soldiers were on edge. Some of them had fought alongside David before, but even they had never seen him like this. This fight was no longer just about strength. This was a battle of skill, of intelligence, of two warriors learning from each other. And it was far from over. The battlefield remained silent. The watching soldiers, both human and Zorthar, barely breathed. They had expected a quick fight, but what they witnessed was something else entirely. Viraka, the strongest warrior of the Zorthar, stood tall, her war axe gripped tightly in her hands. She had fought countless battles, won hundreds of duels, and crushed enemies far larger than this human. Yet she had been struck twice. Not deep wounds, but enough to make her realize something important. This fight was not hers to dominate. This human, Sergeant David Cole, was not just another opponent. He was a true warrior. David, standing a short distance away, remained calm. He wasn't tired. He wasn't afraid. His blue eyes focused on Viraka with sharp intensity, reading her movements, waiting for an opening. Viraka exhaled. She had been fighting with strength, but David fought with patience. Perhaps brute force alone was not the key to victory here. The shift in battle. Viraka adjusted her stance. Her muscles, once tense with the urge to overpower, now moved with careful precision. She stopped swinging recklessly. Instead, she watched David. David noticed the change immediately. His grip on the knife tightened. She wasn't underestimating him anymore. She attacked, not with wild power, but with calculated precision. A quick, controlled slash aimed at his shoulder. David ducked and moved back, avoiding the strike by inches. But Viraka had expected that. The moment he dodged, she shifted her footing and swung again, adjusting to his movement. David barely managed to twist his body, feeling the air ripple as the axe passed dangerously close. She was adapting. He smiled slightly. Good. David changed his approach. Instead of retreating, he dashed forward. The sudden aggression caught Viraka by surprise. His knife flickered, aiming for her leg. Viraka twisted at the last second, but the blade scraped against her armor, leaving another mark. Before she could counter, David was already moving back, out of reach. Viraka let out a deep breath. Clever, she admitted. David gave a small nod. You too. The watching crowd was frozen. Never before had they seen such a duel. Two warriors adapting, learning, and respecting each other with every move. The hidden strength. Viraka felt something unusual inside her. Excitement. She had always believed strength was the greatest weapon. That was the way of the Zorthar. The strong ruled, the weak obeyed. But David was proving something different. He was not stronger than her, not physically, yet he was dangerous. Because he was calm, because he was patient, because he was willing to think, to wait, to strike only when the time was right. Viraka had always seen patience as a weakness, but now she sought its strength. The unexpected move. Viraka took a step back, raising her war axe again. This time, she watched David even more carefully. The battle continued, both warriors exchanging attacks and dodges, each learning from the other. Then David saw his chance. Viraka shifted her weight for a heavy swing. It was a strong attack, but David had seen this pattern before. He anticipated it. He moved. Instead of dodging back, he dropped low and surged forward. His knife flickered towards the weak point in her armor, right under her ribs. It was the perfect strike. But Viraka had also been watching. At the last second, she shifted her body just enough. David's knife struck, but not deep. Instead of piercing through, it barely grazed her side. And then, Viraka moved. Her large hand shot out, faster than anyone expected. She grabbed David's wrist. The crowd gasped. Viraka smirked. Got you. David tensed. He had made a mistake. He had gone in too deep, and now Viraka had caught him. For the first time in the battle, he was trapped. The Zorthar warriors cheered. The humans held their breath. Viraka raised her war axe, ready to end the duel. But then, David acted. Before she could strike, he twisted his wrist, slipping from her grip like water. He rolled backward, putting distance between them in a blink. Viraka's eyes widened. He had escaped. The crowd was stunned. No one had ever broken free from her grip before. David stood up slowly, wiping a bit of dust from his sleeve. He looked at Viraka with a calm expression. "Almost," he said. Viraka blinked. Then she laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. This was not frustration, not anger. It was admiration. The warrior's decision. Viraka took a step back and lowered her axe. The duel was not over yet, but something inside her had shifted. This human, he had earned her respect. She had always believed the strongest warrior was the one who hit the hardest, who stood the tallest. But David Cole had shown her something new. Sometimes strength was not about power. It was about control, patience, adaptation. Viraka rolled her shoulders and grinned. "This," she said, "is the best fight I have had in years." David gave a small nod, glad to hear it. They stood there, two warriors recognizing each other as equals. The battle was not over, but it had already changed both of them. And no matter who won, this fight would never be forgotten. The battlefield remained frozen in silence. The duel between Sergeant David Cole and Commander Viraka had gone far beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a show of strength had turned into something else entirely, a battle of skill, patience, and respect. Both warriors had tested each other, adapted, and learned. Now, they stood a few feet apart, their bodies tense but their eyes filled with something unexpected. Admiration. Viraka rolled her shoulders, gripping her war axe with both hands. Her golden armor bore light scratches, marks left by David's precise strikes. They were not deep wounds, but they were proof that he had gotten past her defenses. David, breathing steadily, held his combat knife at the ready. His uniform was dusty, and a thin line of sweat trailed down his forehead. He had dodged, countered, and escaped her grasp, but he knew this fight was reaching its final stage. One mistake could end it. A new approach. Viraka exhaled. She could not rely on brute strength alone. This human had proven that power was not the only path to victory. She needed to be smarter. With a sudden burst of speed, she lunged forward, bringing her axe down in a controlled yet powerful arc. It was not a wild swing. This time, she was precise. David moved, stepping to the side just in time, but Viraka was ready. She twisted her body, swinging the handle of her axe instead of the blade. The unexpected move caught David off guard. The wooden shaft struck his shoulder, sending him stumbling back a few steps. It was not a heavy blow, but it was enough. Viraka grinned. "You are fast, human, but even you can be hit." David rolled his shoulder, testing the impact. It stung, but he had felt worse. He gave a small nod. "Not bad." For the first time, the human soldiers watching felt a flash of fear. Until now, David had avoided every attack. But now he had been struck. Was the tide turning? A silent understanding. David's grip on his knife tightened. He could feel it. The fight was reaching its peak. Viraka was learning, adapting, just as he was. But he still had one advantage. Viraka was a warrior of power and skill, but David had something she lacked: unpredictability. He took a deep breath, adjusting his stance. Then he did something unexpected. He charged. Viraka's eyes widened in surprise. Until now, David had been careful, waiting for her to make a move. But now he was attacking first. His knife flashed as he closed the distance. Viraka barely had time to react. She swung her axe, but David ducked, rolling beneath the strike. Then he struck. Not with his knife, with his fist. Viraka felt the impact as David's knuckles met the side of her armored ribs. It was not a strong punch, not enough to harm her, but it was enough to unbalance her for a fraction of a second. And that was all he needed. In that moment, David moved behind her, his knife pressing lightly against the exposed part of her neck. The crowd gasped. The Zorthar warriors, who had believed in Viraka's dominance, stared in shock. The human soldiers who had feared David might lose held their breath. Viraka stood still, feeling the cold edge of the knife against her skin. David had won, or had he? The final choice. For a long moment, neither warrior moved. Then, slowly, David stepped back, lowering his knife. Viraka turned, looking at him carefully. "You had me." David met her gaze. "Yes, you could have finished the duel." David tilted his head slightly. "Could have." Viraka studied him for a moment, then let out a deep laugh. "I see. You are not just strong. You are wise." The duel was not about victory anymore. It was about understanding. David had proven that brute strength was not the only path to winning. He had proven that patience, intelligence, and adaptability were just as powerful as any weapon. And Viraka had learned a valuable lesson. Strength was important, but so was strategy. A warrior's respect. Viraka let her war axe rest against the ground and stepped forward. Then, to everyone's shock, she extended her hand. David hesitated for only a second before shaking it. The battlefield, once filled with tension, suddenly erupted into cheers from both sides. The Zorthar warriors, who had believed in strength above all, now saw something new. The humans, who had feared the duel, now felt pride. The fight had ended, but something greater had been won: respect. Viraka grinned. "Human, you have earned my respect this day." David nodded. "Same to you." The war between their species would continue. Battles would still be fought. But this moment, this duel, would never be forgotten. A human had faced an alien warrior in single combat. And in the end, both had won. The battlefield was no longer silent. Both human and Zorthar warriors erupted into noise, some cheering, some murmuring in disbelief. The duel that was meant to prove the superiority of one species over the other had ended in an unexpected way. David Cole had not defeated Viraka with brute force. He had not needed to. He had shown skill, patience, and strategy, qualities that the Zorthar had rarely respected before. And now, their greatest warrior, Commander Viraka, had extended her hand in respect. It was an image that no one on either side would forget. The aftermath of battle. David wiped the sweat from his forehead as he sheathed his combat knife. His body ached from dodging, rolling, and countering Viraka's powerful attacks. But despite the pain, he felt no regret. He had done what he set out to do. Viraka, still gripping her war axe, studied him with a strange look in her yellow eyes. "You are different from the humans I have fought before," she said. David raised an eyebrow. "Yeah? How so?" Viraka let out a deep chuckle. "Most humans rely on technology. They hide behind their weapons, their ships, their machines. But you fought with nothing but your own skill." David shrugged. "Sometimes, the simplest weapons are the most effective." Viraka nodded, her respect for him growing even more. "Perhaps the humans are stronger than I believed." The reactions from both sides. The Zorthar warriors exchanged uneasy glances. For their entire lives, they had been taught that strength was the only thing that mattered, that their species was superior in combat, in endurance, in power. But now, their greatest fighter had nearly been bested by a human. Some of them were displeased. Others, however, saw what Viraka had seen. David was not just a soldier. He was a warrior. On the other side, the human soldiers were still processing what had happened. "Did he just beat her?" one of them whispered. "No, I don't think he needed to," another replied. "She knows he could have." "That's even better." General Parker, the human commander, watched with narrowed eyes. He had expected David to put up a fight, but he had never imagined that Viraka would acknowledge him as an equal. This was no longer just about a duel. This was something bigger, a warrior's promise. Viraka took a step closer, lowering her voice so only David could hear. "You spared me when you had the chance to end it," she said. David nodded. This fight was never about killing. It was about proving something. Viraka smirked. And you have proven it well. She glanced at her warriors, who were still murmuring in shock. They will remember this. I will remember this. David crossed his arms. So what happens now? Viraka's expression became serious. The war between our people is not over. I am still a commander of the Zorthar. My duty is to fight. David's face remained unreadable, but he nodded. And mine is to protect my people. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then, Viraka spoke again, but she let out a slow breath. If we meet again on the battlefield, I will not forget what you have taught me today. David met her gaze. Neither will I. It was not a peace treaty. It was not an alliance. But it was something important, a promise between warriors. A shift in the war. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, Viraka turned to her soldiers and lifted her war axe into the air. The duel is over, she declared. This human has earned my respect. Let no one doubt his strength or his skill. The Zorthar warriors looked at each other, uncertain, but they could not deny what they had seen. Slowly, one by one, they pounded their fists against their chests, a traditional salute to a worthy warrior. The human soldiers watched in amazement as the same alien warriors who had mocked them earlier now showed respect to one of their own. General Parker stepped forward, nodding toward David. You've done something incredible today, Sergeant. David simply shrugged. Just did what I had to. Parker smirked. Well, whatever you did, you might have just changed the course of this war. A duel that would be remembered. As the Zorthar warriors prepared to leave, Viraka turned back one last time. We will meet again, human, she said, her voice firm. And when we do, I hope you are ready. David gave a small smile. Always. With that, Viraka and her warriors departed, leaving the battlefield behind. The war was not over. Battles would still be fought. But something had changed. A human had dueled an alien warrior, and instead of death, the outcome had been something far greater. Understanding. As David stood among his fellow soldiers, he couldn't help but wonder. Would they meet again as enemies, or as something else entirely? Only time would tell. The battlefield was quiet once more. The dust had settled, and both armies had withdrawn to their respective camps. The duel between Sergeant David Cole and Commander Viraka had ended, but its impact was only beginning to take shape. David stood among his fellow soldiers, still feeling the weight of the battle in his limbs. The tension in the air was different now. The fear that had gripped his comrades earlier was fading, replaced by something else. Pride. The human soldiers had witnessed something extraordinary. A single man had stood against the might of the Zorthar's strongest warrior, and had not only survived but gained her respect. And respect, David knew, could change the course of history. Ripples in the ranks. Back in the human war camp, General Parker observed David closely. The older man had been in countless battles, had seen both victory and defeat, but what had happened today was something new. You know what you've done, don't you? Parker asked. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Honestly, sir, I just did what I thought was right. Parker smirked. Well, what you did might be bigger than you realize. He leaned in slightly. You've planted a seed in their minds. You showed them that humans aren't weak, that we don't just rely on machines and weapons. David nodded. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just fought the way I knew how. Parker chuckled. And that's exactly why it worked. He placed a hand on David's shoulder. Get some rest, Sergeant. You've earned it. As David walked away, he couldn't help but think about Viraka's last words. We will meet again, human. Would it be as enemies, or as something else? A commander's reflection. Meanwhile, in the Zorthar camp, Viraka sat in deep thought. Her warriors had expected her to be angry, humiliated even. But she was neither. She was intrigued. The duel had changed something inside her. She had fought countless battles against humans before, had seen their machines and tactics, had crushed them with superior strength. Yet, this single human had challenged her in a way no one ever had. Not just with skill, but with intelligence, with patience, with respect. One of her lieutenants approached cautiously. "Commander, what are your orders? Do we continue the assault?" Viraka looked at him, then at the stars above. "No," she said after a long pause. "We wait." The lieutenant frowned. "Wait? But the humans? The humans have proven they are not what we thought." She stood, gripping the handle of her war axe. "This war may not be as simple as we believed." The lieutenant hesitated, then saluted. "Understood, Commander." As he left, Viraka closed her eyes for a moment. She had fought for her people, for honor. But today, she had learned something new. Perhaps strength was not the only path forward. The beginning of something new. Back at the human camp, David lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling of his tent. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the duel, the look in Viraka's eyes when she realized he could have won, and the way she had extended her hand in respect. A part of him wondered, what if this was the start of something bigger? Could a single duel change the course of a war? Could two warriors from different species build a bridge where there had only been conflict? He didn't know. But as he finally closed his eyes, one thought remained clear in his mind. If the day came when they met again, he would be ready. Not just for battle, but for whatever came next. Epilogue. A message from the stars. Days passed, then weeks. The war continued, but something was different. Reports came in. Zorthar forces were no longer attacking as aggressively as before. Their movements had slowed. Their strategies had changed. And then, one day, a message arrived. Not an attack, not a threat. A message. It was from Commander Viraka, and it was addressed to Sergeant David Cole.